Hey guys, what's up? How do you make a bad fantasy movie, right? There's a lot of fantasy movies that are really bad, and I think out of all of the genres, the fantasy genre is the one genre where there's a higher concentration of bad movies than any other genre. Maybe horror also. There's a lot of bad horror movies. But the thing about horror movies is they can get away with being bad. Like horror movies can get away with being bad because horror movies have special effects and it has a soundtrack that's like that has a lot of tension in it. Like it's actually and it's just like horror movies, as long as they're scary, they don't have to be good because they're just supposed to be scary. So if you put some, scary masks in there and screams and like you can make it horrible. Like if you look at the best horror movies are all really bad horror movies. Like there's not a lot of horror movies that are also really good movies. They're pretty much bad. And like there's a lot of them. There's like Friday the 13th, right? Those movies are horrible. They're really bad. They're not only really bad, but they're all the same. Like it's the same exact plot every time. It's the same exact movie every time. And Friday the 13th there's like what, 10 of them or more of them, to the point where they just even stopped doing Friday the 13th, and now they started doing like Freddy meets Jason or Jason meets the alien or something like that. They just like stopped even making Friday the 13th, and they made these crossovers with Friday the 13th and other movies. And it's just because it became iconic. But at the same time, if you ask people that love horror movies, they're going to say Friday the 13th was one of the best movies ever made. But actually Friday the 13th are like the worst movies ever made. But they can get away with it, even though every movie's the same. There's a house in the woods by a lake, and then there's Jason, the hockey mask, murderer, whatever, with an axe, right? And there's like 10 movies, and they're all pretty much exactly the same thing. I know because I saw them at the movie theater, and I would go to all of them because at the time they were fun to watch. But they're horrible. It's not like you got something out of the movie. You got absolutely nothing. It's just like, you go in, it's a little bit scary, and then you have some popcorn and some drinks, and yeah, I don't know. I guess it's a good time at the time, When you're a kid, you watch that kind of stuff, But they can get away with it. Fantasy movies, when they're bad, and they're bad, and they're just not enjoyable when they're bad. And the thing about fantasy movies is it's very easy to make bad ones, because a lot of people that make movies, I think, they're like, well, what do fantasy fans like about fantasy movies? And it's sort of like, well, fantasy fans like unicorns and pegasuses and dragons and wizards and knights and sorcerers and kings and princesses and castles and quests and magic items and magic weapons and monsters, right? It's real easy to make a movie just by putting all of these things together, but it just doesn't have any point to it. It doesn't have a plot. It has like, or maybe it does have a plot, but it's like a really weak plot. It's a plot where like, okay, the journey to find the Holy Grail of the King Arthur books is not a really strong plot. In fact, there was nothing. I mean, the way that all went is very, very interesting. Basically, what made it interesting about finding the Holy Grail was they never found it. And I don't know if they did find it or not, or in some books they found it, in other books they didn't find it. But the thing is, if you watched the movie, if you watched Excalibur, the movie, basically they all like ended up hanging from trees or something like that. All of the knights were, I don't know, like killed by the sorceress or whatever, who was like after the knights. None of them found the Holy Grail. Or did they find the Holy Grail? I don't even know. It's like that's not even clear. But that wasn't, even though that was a big part, a plot line of the King Arthur story, it wasn't the main plot line of the King Arthur story. It was just a plot line. It was just like where the story ended up going. But it wasn't the main plot. The main plot was, and this is why the story is good, and it's not because there were knights in it. It was because the main plot was, aside from the magic sword, which was really cool, the way they got the sword, pulled it out of the stone. There's a lot of meaning to that, you know. The pulling the sword from the stone, and only one person can do it, is sort of like, you know, whoever's fated to be king can pull the sword out of the stone, and if you're not fated to be king, you can't do it. And if you are fated to be king, then you can do it. But it's not just be king, it's unify the land and be a chivalrous king with a circle of chivalrous knights around you. So there was a lot of different ideas where it's like, hey, there were lots of kings, and there were like lots of, I guess, tribes and whatever in the area, but none of them were good kings, and none of the knights were chivalrous good knights. And so the whole idea was the round table, where they would have these knights that would get together, and the most powerful knights in the land would get together and be the natural leaders of the whole land. They were unifying, I guess it was England at the time, right? The whole UK, they were unifying it, and it's still called the United Kingdom, okay? That's what's interesting about it, is the King Arthur story happened in the United Kingdom. King Arthur unites the kingdom, and they still call it the United Kingdom to this day. And I really do think that the King Arthur story had a big influence on that. Whether I'm right or not about it, you know, maybe, you know, who knows? But it is a coincidence, isn't it? It is something that kind of gets pieced together. Like, you know, King Arthur took a land that was basically chaotic, and there was no union there, and united the whole area, which is now England, or the United Kingdom, of, you know, the whole area, the whole UK, and it's called United Kingdom. So I think it's big. I mean, I guess that story's bigger in the UK than it is in other parts of the world, because that story took place in the UK and stuff. It's like local to the UK. But the whole point of it, there was a lot of very meaningful stuff that goes into that story, where you know, like the knight that wanted something from Merlin that he really shouldn't be doing, and there was just a lot of very, very, like, there was love, there was also betrayal, there was also like King Arthur's wife cheated on him with Lancelot or something like that, right? And so there was a lot of story there, and Merlin is enough of a story on his own, because Merlin is like a very, very interesting character and a very mysterious character, and adds a lot, pretty much made everything in the story. I think Merlin is more interesting in the story than King Arthur or Lancelot, any of the knights, Morgana, like any of the characters. Merlin, like, you know, that's why they have a show called Merlin, and it's like, forget about the rest of the, you know, the rest of the King Arthur people. Let's just do a show about Merlin, because he's the interesting one. It's just like Lord of the Rings, Gandalf is the interesting character because he's the wizard, and they're like a lot like the elves are way more interesting than the hobbits, you know, and some creatures are way more interesting than others, like the tree creature. But that's the thing about it, is that King Arthur is a story that has meaning to it. There's a lot of meaning in the story. There's a lot of this drama, there's meaning, there's actual plot. But if you really look at Lord of the Rings, there's some meaning there. But what they did was, mostly in Lord of the Rings, was make it a huge quest, and it was about all of these fantasy elements put together. So it wasn't all good or bad like Lord of the Rings. It had its good points, and I think it had its weak points, but I wasn't into Lord of the Rings, just because the main character, the main hero, was this hobbit who really wasn't heroic at all. And I think that was part of the story where, like, let's get a hero that's not heroic and let's get him to achieve something great. And I think that speaks to a lot of people that don't feel like, you know, that they're that heroic and they can relate to the Hobbit and Frodo and Bilbo more than they can relate to maybe a knight or someone that's like a hero, like Conan the Barbarian, or, you know, like you can relate to Conan the Barbarian, or you can not relate to that. Not everyone is a Conan the Barbarian kind of person. Some people are like a Hobbit kind of person, and they want to be a hero also in their own way. But what the Hobbits did was they knew they couldn't, you know, pretty much save the day by themselves, so they got the wizard together with the dwarves and the elves and all of the creatures. You know, they basically brought all of these very powerful creatures and beings together in order to face this evil. You know, so they couldn't do it themselves. They know they couldn't do it themselves, but they were able to organize a party of powerful enough adventurers to get the plot going in that story. You know, so that was interesting. So if, you know, there's a lot of, if there's meaning in the story, then it's a better fantasy story. But if it's just fantasy elements, then there's nothing to the story. If you look at the Red Sonja movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger was great in Conan the Barbarian, not good in Conan the Destroyer, even though people thought it was an okay movie. It was an okay movie, but if you put it next to, it was an okay movie because that's basically the kind of movie, the kind of fantasy movie that was just more common. You know, more often than not, if you go to the theater or even on HBO or something and you watch a fantasy movie, more often than not, the fantasy movie is going to be an okay, not so great movie. And it really blew everybody away that Conan the Barbarian was such a great, amazing movie, because it had meaning, it had a plot, it had, like, there was meaning to the movie, there was meaning in the story. It meant something to people. People felt for it. And it was excellently executed, it was excellently done, acted, written. The score, the music of it was just compelling. None of that was in the second movie. It wasn't well written. It was just, we succeeded with this great movie, and now we've got all these investors saying, we got to make another movie. We're going to invest all this money in the second movie. And, you know, and then it's going to be as good as the first one, obviously, because the first one was good. What's interesting is that, like, nobody catches the pattern where if the first movie is good, all of a sudden these investors are like, we got to make another one. Let's put all this money into the second movie because it's going to make all this money, because all they care about is the movie making money, not the movie being great. Conan the Barbarian was a movie that the people that were involved in it wanted it to be great, you know, and then the second movie was the sequel, which was like, oh, you know, we have to make another one, but nobody, it wasn't like they tried to make a great movie. They just tried to make a copy of the first movie, you know? So it's like, you know, that's what it is. They would try to make a copy of the first movie, and they tried to make a continuation of it because the first one was successful. And for no other reason, obviously, than to make money from it, because there was no serious writing, there was no serious acting, there was no serious music. The jokes were it was a lot of jokes, which kept it very light, but at the same time, the jokes weren't like funny jokes. It wasn't like watching a Mel Brooks movie where, like, the jokes are funny. You know, like, you know, it's jokes from beginning to end, like Airplane. You know, that movie, that, like, there were jokes in the movie, but it was an actual comedy where it was, like, really funny. This was more of a fantasy movie with humor in it. And what humor was, it wasn't like anything original or funny anyway. And the things that were the main parts of the movie were kind of humorous. There was one good battle scene in the end, but that was pretty much it, you know? And so that's kind of how you make a bad fantasy movie, or like a bad any kind of movie, is just copy something that was successful just because the first one was successful and now you got to make another one. I think this is what, I think they do that so much. The first movie's good and then let's make more. Jurassic Park, good movie, good first movie, right? Of course, they had to make 3 more or whatever. I don't even know how many more they made, trying to make it as good as the first one, but they weren't because nobody wrote the second. There was no second part of that movie. That movie was written from beginning to end. That was the entire story. Like that movie was written beginning to end. There was no other. That's as long as the story was. That was written to be a standalone thing. It wasn't written as part 1 of something that's going to have more parts to it, right? It's not like the writer's like, I've got 5 movies that I imagine, and I'm going to write the first one, then I'm going to write the second one. I'm going to, that's different. That's like you intend to make 5 movies and you already have the story in your mind about what is going to happen in each movie, right? So when what's his name, Martin or something, whatever, for Lord of the Rings, not Lord of the Rings, for the Game of Thrones, right? So for Game of Thrones, the guy that he wrote the first book, and then he wrote the second book and the third one because it was a continuing thing. He wanted to be continuing. Same thing with Conan the Barbarian. That was a continuing thing, but they couldn't use, I guess, the original books or anything in the movies for some reason, because they didn't use any of it in Conan the Destroyer. They didn't use anything from the books. But I guess in some stories it's like, okay, we have this like really long story that we thought up. The thing about this is like converting a book into a movie is like really, really difficult. And converting a book into a movie or a comic book or a book into a comic book or a movie or anything like that is really, really difficult because a book, you can basically, when you read a book, you could sit there, you could read it for 20 hours, 40 hours, 100 hours, right? It's that much content in a book. And it's very, very detailed and it's very specific, and the conversations can go on for a long time. You could be reading like a whole chapter that takes you 4 hours to read, right? Of just a conversation, one conversation happening inside the book. And that's one chapter out of 25 chapters or 30 chapters, right? And it could just be one conversation. And the thing is, in a movie, you can't do that. You can't make it longer than 2 hours, and pretty much, And if you make it longer than 2 hours, it becomes very, very slow and boring. It has to go fast. It has to move from point to point, and has to go to the next thing. Obviously, in books, you can go into details and explain very specific things that you cannot do in a movie. Like a book can be 300 pages, which can take you a week to read or 2 weeks or a month to read, right? Because you might not sit down with it for, beginning to end. You might like open it, read a chapter, read 10 pages, put it down, read some later. A movie, you're not going to do that. You're not going to sit down for 10 minutes and turn it off and then come back a few days later and then turn it back on for another 15 minutes. A movie, you're going to sit there from beginning to end for 2 hours. So there's only so much content you can put in it. And when there's a story with a lot of content, you really have to abbreviate it. You just have to make it's got to be the abbreviation. It's got to be the summary of the story, or maybe the main part of the story, or some kind of main idea in the story. So you're not going to go into all of these side quests and all of these like other fringe ideas in a book. You're only going to stay with what is the main point of that book. What is the main plot of the book? And we're just going to make a story around the main plot, and then we're going to make it into a movie. And we're going to figure out how to tell the whole story beginning to end in about 2 hours. So converting a book to a movie is very, very difficult. And it's got to be, and I think it's only successful when the person writing the book could actually write a screenplay also. Like whoever wrote the book to write the screenplay, not have like somebody interpret the novel and change it into a screenplay, but have the author that wrote the book, like having them approached and go, we want to make a movie. Can you write a screenplay around the main parts of your story? And have the actually author write a screenplay about the most important parts and the most compelling parts of the story. So basically what you would do is just include the most compelling, best, interesting parts, and you'd have to like get rid of a lot of the other stuff. And so that's why a lot of people are like, oh, I like the book because because the movie didn't explain anything. Well, the book is a 300-page book, but the movie is a 2-hour movie. There's just no way to do it. You can't put the whole book in the movie. It's impossible. And so that's the thing. If you just put a movie together that has fantasy elements, and there's a lot. I mean, I've seen like tons of these movies. Like there's nothing about them that's cool. If you want like a great movie, you gotta have a lot of great stuff. You gotta have great music, because music really does stir up emotion and makes the person feel like good music, good songs in the movie, or like good instrumentals in the movie. It directs people's emotions. It talks to their emotions. It makes them feel like, oh, that's a battle scene, or that's a combat scene, or something like that, where it's like tense music, or there's a love scene with like, violins and whatever. People feel for it, and you want to have great acting. You want to put it all together. You want to have a great screenplay, a great idea, great acting. It's got to be because you want to make it something great, not just you want to make a fantasy movie. Like the best way to make a bad fantasy movie is to want to make a fantasy movie, because then you're just thinking, oh, okay, so I'm going to put a dragon in there, and I put a knight in there, and the knight's going to battle the dragon, and the dragon's going to like breathe fire in the knight. And then the wizard's going to try to save the knight, with his staff, and shoot the dragon with magic energy and whatever. It's like that would be a cool scene, but if that's all there is a cool scene and cool special effects and just fantasy elements, it's just going to feel like, what are we looking? What is the point of the movie? It's like, what are they even saying? Like, what is this movie about? Because it's just got fantasy elements in it, a quest, and there's this magic item. It's like, oh, okay, another like no plot, no main character development, no anything, just fantasy elements to make a fantasy movie, right? So it's like with Conan the Barbarian or anything like that, like they wanted to say something. Okay. Yeah. I don't know what happened to just my... I don't know what happened to my camera just now. But anyway, I don't know what that was. Okay. I was able to clear it out though. Okay, so so what they... I thought my camera crashed for a second, but it didn't. Okay. But anyway... Okay, so anyway, okay. They weren't able to, it's got to be about something, and it's got to say something. Like Conan the Barbarian was really about, there was a story there. It was about good versus evil. It was about might versus magic. It was about this guy who wasn't a magician, but he had to battle a very powerful magician. And he battled him with steel, with swords, with muscle, with strength, and it's about that. It's about human strength. And it's also a love story, and it's just a lot of stuff that they took from the books, from the original books, from the comic books, they put a lot of the best stuff from the books and the comic books into the story, but it had a plot. It was interesting. It was cool. It wasn't just fantasy elements put together, like in a lot of fantasy movies. If you go to Netflix, right, and you click fantasy movies, you're gonna see like a couple of good movies, which are like known good fantasy movies, maybe Marvel universe, whatever it is, right? You're gonna see a ton of really bad fantasy movies. And really with fantasy movies, seriously, like, I don't know exactly, but I'm gonna say 80% are bad, but 20% are good. There's a lot of great fantasy movies. There's probably a higher concentration of great fantasy movies than anything else, but there's a higher concentration, I think, of fantasy movies also than anything else. And I'm going to say that 20% of fantasy movies are really good, and 80% are really not good. They're not that great. They're underwhelming. They're not the same. You don't feel like, oh, so you're watching something cool, like you're watching something great, because it's just not well put together. It's not. They want to make a fantasy movie, but they don't want to make a great fantasy movie, and it's obvious because they're not trying to. It's not that they don't know how. It's that, like, if you try to make something great, you'll figure it out. Like, you'll figure out how. You'll figure out how to make something great. If you really want to make a great movie, you will figure it out. Like, as you're making the movie, how do I make this great? And you could tell when someone's doing their best at something, or if someone is just trying to get this done, then that done, then that done, And a lot of these fantasy movies, and I mean, you could just see them on Netflix because they're on Netflix, even if you love fantasy movies, they're like so hard to watch because they're not good. They're really bad. And it's because they're just not about anything. They're just fantasy elements put together, and they call it a fantasy movie because there's a queen and there's a princess, and it's the same exact story that they've had in like every other bad fantasy movie, right? There's no point to it. The acting isn't good. The writing isn't good. The music isn't great. You watch it for, like, as opposed to like one thing you watch and then you'll be like, oh, that's a great movie, and you watch it like 2 hours straight, and that's a great movie, and then there's like, and you really enjoy it, and you're like, oh, I love that movie, it was so cool. And then another movie where you watch like seriously like 10-15 minutes of it, and then you have to turn it off because it's just so terrible, and you really want to enjoy it. You want it to be a good fantasy movie, but it's just so bad. It's just like, there's nothing in it. It's just like maybe a queen talking to a knight, and blah 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 blah. It's like, they're just like, or maybe a fight scene between, I don't know, some guy with a sword and a wizard. Like, and even like, even if they try to make it good, it's still not good because it hasn't been inspired. It's not about anything. It's not like, you don't have to really only like put great actors and great writers and great musicians and great directors. Obviously, if you do that, you're probably going to get a great movie because these people love what they do and they're good at what they do. But there's great movies that come out with actors that no one's heard of, directors no one's heard of, musicians that no one's heard of, like, directors that no one's heard of before, and it's a great movie. And so it's got to be about something to make a great movie. It's got to be about something. It's got to be it's got fantasy elements in it because it's a fantasy movie, and it's taking place in the Middle Ages or some age where there's dragons and swords and stuff like that, where there's fantasy elements, but it's about something, and it's interesting, and the people that are making it are interested in it, and they're they're into it. You could tell, like, they're into it. They're into the movie itself. They're into the story, and they want to really communicate that story to the public, right? But then, if you're just putting together just a bunch of maybe special effects, or even though special effects are cool, but if you're just putting together movies that, or like a movie that's just got like, oh, let's take a dragon and make it fight a unicorn or something like that and see who wins. It's like, that would be cool, but there's nothing more than that. It's like, it's got to be more than that. It's got to be more than just fantasy elements, and it's got to be about something. It's got to be about something that speaks to people, that means something to people, and that matters, right? And it's got to be well done, and it's got to be original. There's got to be some originality where the story cannot be like every other story. The reason is, it's not as much because it's a copy of something, but it is because it's a copy of something. It's just that when the story in the movie is a story you've seen before in other movies, you already know what's going to happen. You already know what the movie's about. There's no surprises. There's no reason to watch it. You've already seen this movie, and it was called something else, right? And there's just nothing about it that's really going to keep your interest, because you've seen this before in 10 other movies that were exactly the same as this one, right? Whereas a good movie, it's different, and you've never seen it before, and it feels like an original, really, really good movie, and you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know how it's going to come out. It's good. It's original because an original story is worth telling, and an original story is worth watching, or worth reading or listening to, but watching if it's a movie, right? A real original story is worth watching as a movie, because you don't know what's going to happen next. When it's a story that's already been done, you already know what's going to happen next, right? If it's a story where, oh yeah, the hero wins again, you know, like superhero movies, like, you know, the hero's just going to win. You know that's going to be the end of the movie. You know, like, the hero of the movie is not going to lose to the villain in a superhero movie. That's just why it's like, you already know how it's going to end. The superhero is going to win, the villain's going to lose. Like, pretty much, like, 100% of the time, like, where did the hero lose and the villain win? Where? Nowhere, because it never happens, you know? But that's the thing, you know, that's the thing. And you want to, original movies, because you watch it because you've never seen it before. You've never seen anything like it before, and that's what makes it interesting. And it's also about something, and something that you feel because the movie's about something, and the movie feels that too, and you relate with the characters, and because they feel real things, and you feel for the characters, and the characters feel for you, because it just goes that way in a movie, where the things that matter, you know, like, and emotions that are there in the movie are kind of like, when you watch that, you actually feel the emotions that are being expressed. And when you feel an emotion from a movie, you know it's really good. When you don't feel anything for the movie, you're like, so what? But when you feel emotion in the movie, you know it's good, because you feel emotion from it. That's the indicator that a movie's great, when you feel emotion from the movie, right? And with a bad movie, it's just like, you feel nothing for it. Like, you just like, there's no emotion, and they don't even try to communicate any kind of emotion in the movie at all, or any kind of interesting story, or any kind of anything. It's just something which has fantasy elements and nothing else. So if you want to make a bad fantasy movie, just put a bunch of like fantasy elements that's been in other fantasy movies, put them all together, and make it look like every other bad fantasy movie that ever happened on the screen. But if you want to make a great one, you know, it's got to be because that story's there and it has to be told. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe, and check out my other videos. And thanks, man. So I'll see you guys in another video. Take care. Bye.